So, Jim,
Yes.
how would you start this movie?
Hi, I'm Jack. I just got finished watching the new Netflix documentary called Jim and Andy, which is following the behind-the-scenes footage shot by Jim Carrey's team on the set of the film Man on the Moon, where he played, where it was like a biopic for Andy Kaufman. If I was fully prepared for it, I would have watched Man on the Moon beforehand, and I do feel bad for not watching it. However, as I'll come to some points later on, I think that I didn't miss too much as long as I kind of got the gist of Andy's character, and I think that Jim Carrey does a good job of explaining what exactly Andy was trying to do. Andy Kaufman, I did not know him particularly well at all, because I don't think that he's a name that really left the US at all, and also maybe just on to further generations. I mean, that most people know him as a character on Taxi, which I've never even seen on UK TV, not once, and I don't think I've ever heard it referenced. So just to my thoughts on the documentary, I thought that it was an interesting documentary, more so for Jim's reflections on the actual filming more than the actual backstage footage itself. That's not to say that the backstage footage is not interesting. I just think that the presentation of the documentary led to it being a lesser factor, as the bulk of the documentary is basically centered around one talking head, like shot in one location, of Jim Carrey just explaining all the different intricacies of like what's actually going on in this clip, or how I was feeling at the time. And that stuff is all very interesting, because even though Jim Carrey's been doing odd bits of work here and there, I feel like he kind of dropped off the face of the earth after the mid-2000s. I mean, you occasionally get him doing things like Kick-Ass 2, but then he comes out against like the very idea of it the moment after he's done it, things like that, and he just doesn't seem to be the old Jim Carrey that you recognise. And I was interested going into this to see, what is he actually like now, just talking. And I think that this documentary does very well in that it uses his prior work to basically talk about where he is now. There's a moment in this documentary where Jim mentions that they couldn't release the backstage footage from the Andy Kaufman stuff because you might think, because they quote, they didn't want people to think Jim's an asshole, like for selling the film, which definitely makes sense from the footage. But once you get past all the character stuff, I still think some people could end up disliking Jim from this just if their views don't align with his at the very end of the film, because he is very much a carefree spirit now. And I found it very interesting to hear his kind of thoughts on things. And he kind of talks about this in the documentaries, that people just expect you to, once you're set up as the funny man, they expect you to stay the funny man. And it's very clear that he's just someone that doesn't give a shit anymore. And watching something like that, I found quite calming. Just because of all the Jim Carrey comedy films that I watched as a kid, and kind of seeing that person growing up and just being fine is quite warming, anyway. And especially when he starts talking about, because Andy Kaufman passes, obviously because they've made the biopic. Not that stopped a few Hollywood productions, but anyway, when he starts talking about that, it's actually like you really tell that it does mean quite a lot to Jim, and that's like more than just the chance to be a great actor, and it is very interesting. So on an idea level, I do really quite enjoy this documentary. I think that's personally down to how I like Jim Carrey, and also I find the lives behind comedians very interesting. If someone didn't like Jim Carrey films, I don't think that they would like this. I mean, that seems obvious, but it's not like this is a universal documentary. It's just, if you're a fan of his, it's just an interesting look into his life. And if you're a fan of Andy Kaufman, I think I would recommend it. I wouldn't say that you get any great insights into Andy himself, but there are moments with his family and his friends, not played by actors, of course, as they are in Man on the Moon. And those moments are, while they lead to some of the most meaningful moments in the documentary as well. If you're interested in Andy's goes further than the comedy, then I'd recommend this. The flaw that I found with this documentary I would say it comes back to one singular cause, but it led to this point of kind of like a butterfly effect thing of, I think that the movie felt like it didn't care enough about the archival footage that it got, which is kind of the selling point in all the trailers if you've seen anything, and kind of showing that there's going to be wacky stuff in there. And there is like occasional moments of where stuff goes a bit lopsided, but they never really feel like they let the moment play out in full. Like, you never really feel like you get to experience it through the backstage footage. And I don't think it's because they don't have the footage. I think it's just because of the way that they've edited this film. Yeah, the editing was something that's bothered me. Not particularly in the Jim Carrey stuff, because it's just him talking to a camera, and they kind of let him have his normal cadence and pacing, and they just kind of let him be him, and there's a nice patience to it because I think it reflects his character. And potentially they're trying to make a kind of chaotic edit through the background for the archival footage, but to me it just felt like they didn't feel like it was attention grabbing enough, and so they just kept chopping around to try and show you the best bits, but didn't really just let you sit and watch it. And I find it quite, not disorientating, but I felt like I could never fully settle into what was happening. For instance, they never actually say how much archival footage there was, so I don't have a scope in my head of how much they've covered. And this sounds very technical things, but it's just things that I felt like would have helped ground a more importance in the archival footage. They also never and I felt like if they paid attention to the fact that they were going through they were progressing throughout, I think that would have been more interesting. There are moments like I mentioned where Andy's family comes into it. One particular moment was was Jim as Andy fighting with Andy's father, and not as Jim Carrey, but because as Jim gets so into the role, kind of his family and friends kind of feel again that it might just be that Jim was talking too spiritually, but it does come across in the footage that they kind of feel that like they're reacting to Andy, not Jim. And there's a fight between the father, and it was for me it was the most emotional part of the documentary, and it's chopped up and edited. I felt like if you just had this clip and you just let it sit there, I think it would be way more impactful, especially when they have, sometimes Jim is talking over the footage and you can't hear what they're saying, and I want to know what they're saying, or they're just playing background music, this is another point, it would just too much background music on the stuff when I just want to watch the footage unedited sometimes, to just show me the whole clip so that I can actually get into it. One thing that I always like to think about whenever they do a found footage film, this is kind of taking a sidestep, but people always say, they just assume that using these old consumer cameras or prosumer, that they've put a filter on or whatever, but they always just assume that because they're using that, people, that's the only thing that they do to get people instantly into it. But I also think that the good found footage films notably just let the clip last longer than it should. And I'm not saying it's just the clips of people's feet for 1 minute, actually happen in home videos, but it's just giving the buffer of, this isn't just a clip that's staged or a clip that's optimized, it is real life that happened, and here's the buffer of either end of non-material that I think cement the more important stuff, and this film kind of trims that out, or it just talks over it, and I just wish there was more of that. And my final point with that, was the background music, which I found the sound mixing for the background, again, very annoying point for some, but I just found it rather too weighted to the background music when I just wanted the archival footage. As well as I found some of the background music choices bordering on annoying, potentially just because, again, half because of the mixing, and then the other half were sometimes just because I could, there were 2 tracks in particular which I know come from free music websites, and I mean they managed to license all the clips, all the other music, which includes David Bowie, 2 David Bowie tracks, so it's not like they didn't have licensing money, and it's from Netflix, but the 2 free music tracks, the moment they came on, if you do anything involving video editing, that at any point you've looked for free background music, you will have heard these tracks. One's Kevin MacLeod, which is just every YouTube vlogger's background music, which actually just even today, before watching the documentary, I heard some of the background music in a vlog, because, and it was a very generic vlog. I know it was just a thing that, again, it won't take like 99% of audiences out of it. But when I hear just a track that I know they've just clicked download MP3 and just dropped it into the mix, I could only focus on that. To me, those two tracks just stood out like a sore thumb. Anyway, Jim and Andy. Again, it just comes back to what I mentioned before. If you're coming into this as you're like, wow, I love crazy backstage stories, I wouldn't fully recommend this. From the sounds of it, like documentaries like the one following The Island of Dr. Moreau seem a lot funnier. And for this, I'd say it's more of a, again, if you're a fan of Jim Carrey, if you're more than just a comedy fan of Andy Kaufman, like the wacky stuff is there, and it's occasional, and I feel like it could have been presented better. But the emotional stuff is really what sells this film, in my opinion. And getting to just see Jim's current worldview on everything. And if you're a fan of those things that I mentioned, I'd definitely recommend checking this out.